Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up, and make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and after making the video on Isaiah Bradley Explained, which did way better than I thought it would, if I'm being honest with you guys. I thought it would be like the John Walker video where it kind of peters along and then just explodes one day, right? Like I think I made that video on like a Tuesday or something, and then by the time everybody got around to watching that episode of Falcon and the Winter Soldier, people started searching for John Walker, and it just blew up on YouTube, right? It was nuts. I was like, wow, okay, cool. So like that's the name of the game, right? Like go back to the days when I would make characters that people were referencing in the movies and TV shows, so everybody knows what in the world's going on, right? It's the foundation of Comics Explained. So looking through the comments, because I do read your all's comments, you guys really wanted me to do truth, red, white, and black, right? So we're going to cover this. We're going to split it into two videos because it's 7 issues long, but we're going to cover this, right? Like today and tomorrow, maybe on Wednesday, or at least maybe on like Thursday, we'll do the second half, right? Because there's an important story that comes out tomorrow that has to do with King in Black. But this basically covers the story of Isaiah Bradley, right? How Isaiah Bradley became Captain America in Marvel Comics. Now, some of the stuff that we have here is not overly important, and the fact the first issue is not the most important thing ever, right? All the first issue does is kind of lay the groundwork for a lot of these guys, right? So like Isaiah Bradley and his wife Faith, that they share a very close relationship, right? It's one of these things where they're kind of depicted in the sense that like at this point in time that it's rough to be a Black American in America. And so in a lot of ways it kind of goes or points toward the notion of like the Black community in a lot of ways kind of being tight-knit, in the sense that it's almost one of those, I wouldn't really call it gatekeeping, but it's one of those like, you know, we kind of keep to ourselves, like we look out for our own and our community, that kind of a thing, right? And there's actually a reason for that, because towards the end of this video, we'll talk about something called the Red Summer of 1919, which if you've never heard of that, it's an actual thing, and it is bananas. It's one of the craziest moments in the history of the United States. But in the end, like what you have is just kind of a rotating cast of people, right? Just these various individuals. The crazy thing about this is not all of them matter, but one of the most important people that matters here is a guy by the name of Sergeant Luke Evans. Now, Sergeant Luke Evans is a guy who's kind of depicted to us as previously a captain in the US military, but ultimately he ended up standing up for a fellow Black soldier who was being, and by all standards of measurement, abused in the military. And so when that happened, because it was considered insubordination, he was demoted down to the rank of sergeant. The crazy thing about this is that he was facing this moment of crisis when he was actually looking at killing himself, right? You know, he didn't really seem, didn't really feel like he had much of a purpose in the military. Now, I can't really speak for the psychological drive behind this. I was never a member of the military, so I don't really know how the proposition of being deranked in the military from like a captain down to a sergeant, how that impacts a person mentally. I know that there are people out there who just kind of look at the military as a means to an end, and I know there are people out there that are like, that's their life, right? So I can't really speak to how this impacts people psychologically. I'm not qualified for that. So I will leave that to somebody who's experienced life in the military. Post your comments down below, because I'm actually really fascinated to know how that impacts a person, if it really does at all. But the change of heart and the idea of like deterring himself from suicide comes in the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And this basically seems to kind of provide renewed interest or renewed vigor for Luke Evans, which sort of sends him forward. Now, following that, you kind of go into this notion of like these guys, by whatever manner and whatever means, taking these different walks of life that ultimately lead them to enlisting in the military. And so what ends up happening is they're all basically transferred to Camp Cathcart in Mississippi in 1942. And this is one of those instances where what you have is effectively 2 battalions or different groups, right? And that's how it was back then. That you had Black Americans who were trained in one group, and then you had white Americans who were trained in another. By the time segregation came along, that began to change, and you saw like Black Americans and white Americans being, desegregated and thrown into a particular group where you basically had them all being trained in the military together, which led to a lot of issues. It led to a lot of problems in terms of how race relations were playing out. So of course, that's not really something that you see here because it takes place long before that. But an interesting conversation that goes on here is between a guy by the name of Dr. Reinstein and a guy by the name of William Price. And William Price is basically the guy who kind of leads this whole situation. He's got his own motivations, his own schemes, but you've also got Dr. Reinhardt. Now, Dr. Reinhardt is basically put here as a guy who is looking to recreate the super soldier serum. There's a lot more to him than that, and we'll talk about that. Unfortunately, you don't really see a lot of him in the beginning. I don't know why I said Reinstein. You don't see a whole lot of Reinstein here in the beginning. There's a little discussion, but the long and short of it is that he wants 300 Black American soldiers, right? That's what he wants. 300 Black soldiers to use for what amounts to effectively an experiment. And that's one of the crazy things that goes on here, is that where you have this conversation between Reinstein and a guy named Mr. Tully, but while they're basically talking to a major, they talk about something called the Black Vine. And the Black Vine is basically this concept that exists, and even now still exists, where you do have like the grapevine, right? So like the rumor mill, where you have like, you know, oh, I heard this or I heard that or something along those lines. But within the Black community, because the Black community was so tight knit at the time, and to a degree still is today, that there's kind of the Black Vine in the sense that like only Black individuals share rumors with other Black individuals, right? Like, you won't believe what I heard or something like that. And they usually, you know, would exclude anybody else who was not part of the Black community. Now, what this has to do with the bigger picture, you know, become more significant later on down the line, is actually a concept they intend to use for their own ends. But the important takeaway from this is that you basically end up having them saying like, we want to utilize this concept of the Black Vine, and that even like the Fuhrer himself in Germany kind of idolizes this notion of like the Black community keeping things to themselves and not really having any conversation with white Americans, which basically leaves white Americans completely oblivious to what's going on within the Black community. The gist here, and the important thing here, is that because of the fact that the notion of the Black Vine is intriguing to Reinstein and to Mr. Tully, and they're talking about the notion of using, you know, this kind of idea in the military, it leads the major to believe that like they want to train Black individuals as counter spies. Now, the thing about this is that at that point in time in the military, it, you know, from what I've been able to gather, Black Americans were largely used not necessarily as cannon fodder, but they were never really given like higher ranking roles, right? It was never one of those things of like, we'll send Black Americans in as spies, or if they did, they would just kind of be like throwaway missions or something along those lines. There was a lot of disrespect and a lot of glass ceiling that was going on with regards to like Black members in the military at that point. The Tuskegee Experiments are a perfect example of that, right? Like giving Black individuals syphilis and then just seeing what happens if it goes untreated, right? That kind of a thing. And so what ends up happening is that in Camp Cathcart at 2300 hours, right, at 11 p.m., that everybody's kind of brought together, right? All these guys are you know, all these soldiers are basically brought in and effectively lined up. And what you end up having is Tully and Reinstein who show up, and they talk to the mayor, and then you have basically Price, like Colonel Price, who shows up. And when Price shows up here, that is kind of like, okay, one thing to understand here is that one, Camp Cathcart doesn't exist. It never existed. We made it up. And two, like Tully and Reinstein are military intelligence. They work for me. They kill the major on the spot and then immediately line up all these Black soldiers and say, okay, we need 300 of you guys, get in the buses, you know, and the others remain behind. And so of course, Isaiah Bradley and a few of these other guys are among the 300 that are thrown in these transport vehicles. And then as they're leaving, all the other soldiers who are left behind are shot and killed, right? They're just executed by these guys. And so from there, what ends up happening is immediately following that, the entire group, as it was taken by the major and Tully and Reinstein, that a cover is essentially issued, right? Where they basically send out blanket letters to all the members of their families, military appearances and the whole 9 yards, saying like they died in a bombing, right? Like they died in a bombing gone wrong, and that's it, right? That's basically all it was. But for Project Super Soldier, the location is one, classified, and two, that's why these 300 guys are here, because Reinstein is basically the science head, and he's here for the purpose of essentially giving these guys a super soldier formula, or at least a variation of it, and trying to create more Captain Americas. Now, a lot of the things as they're depicted here are basically a reflection of the time. So for example, you have Price, who's saying like, okay, like we need a whole bunch of Negro blood, right? Because as far as the ideology was back at that point in time, there was actually a difference between Black blood and white blood. That's what people believed back then, right? And the funny thing is there's people who still believe it now, right? Like imagine that, right? You know, the belief that there's a difference between Black blood and white blood, right? I mean, you know, people who believe that, I don't know what to say, right? They're, you know, it's I don't know. I don't know. It's just, you can't take people like that seriously, right? But like at that point in time, that's what people believed, right? That's how backwards American philosophy was. And so one of the things that's kind of crazy is they actually start talking about Reinstein, who believes that there is no difference between Black and white blood, because there's not. There really isn't. But, you know, it's one of those things where it's kind of like, we'll keep that under wraps, right? Like we'll just kind of let the world continue believing that there's a big difference. The important thing here and the takeaway from this is that every one of these soldiers, right, all 300 of them were basically taken into different observation rooms. Systematically, they were lined up, they were given an injection of the super soldier serum as it had been created by Reinstein to see what would happen in order to see if they would actually become a super soldier. And the experiments were pretty gruesome, right? Like one of the guys, for example, is given 5 cc's of the serum, which proves to be too much. It overloads his body and he quite literally explodes. You know, while all that's going on, again, like all these letters are being sent out to these different people. But when you get to Faith's wife and the statement is made to her, hey, hey, like, your husband has died in a bombing, she doesn't believe it. She's like, I want to see the body. Like, I want to see the body of my husband, right? Like, I need that kind of closure. Now understand, it's not because she's skeptical of the military, it's because she simply just wants closure, right? Like, I want to see the body of my husband. But she's constantly told, like, the cask is closed, right? We don't recommend that you see the body of your husband. Now, of course, Isaiah, along with a handful of other guys, are given the injection of the super soldier serum, and they become super soldiers. It basically ends up working. But when the body of Isaiah Bradley is shown to his wife, Faith, we don't really initially see what it is that she sees. She's just totally flabbergasted by it. And so what you end up having is these really only individuals who survived, right? So like these 7 guys who lived through the super soldier process, everybody else is dead, right? So 293 black soldiers died in the super soldier experiments under the government's version, or I guess the reworked version of Project Rebirth, that these guys are basically taken on a series of missions, right? Now, one of the things that happens is that for one of the guys, Maurice, his father basically ends up killing his wife and then killing himself, right? Because of the experience of losing his family. While that goes on, you then have Sergeant Evans, who starts talking about something called the Red Summer. Now, this is one of the most interesting aspects of this story, because Sergeant Evans is one of these guys who was a part of this, or at least puts on the perception that he was a part of it. And he says it was basically the war at home. Right now, here's the reality of the summer of 1919, right? The Red Summer of 1919. It's wildly complex, and it's far more than we can cover here in this video. But the long and short of it is that it was basically this summer-wide massacre of Black Americans across the United States. It was the single closest the United States ever came to a full-on race-based civil war in the US. And the reason why is because you had a series of things that were taking place. For example, society across the board at the time, while, with the exception of the most progressive individuals, kind of had this mentality that as long as Black Americans stayed in the South and kind of quote-unquote stayed in their place, that more or less everything was good. And this came to fruition by way of the fact that in the aftermath of World War I, that you saw a lot of veterans who were coming back to the United States, and then in turn you saw like what was called the Great Migration, which was a whole host of Black Americans basically leaving the South due to the lack of job opportunities, equal rights, things like that, and moving to the North. And so in Chicago, for example, the population exploded by like 148%. This gave way to a huge amount of fear among white Americans that Black Americans were taking job opportunities, right? They were taking economic gains, different things like that. And so this anxiety boiled over into fear. Now understand, that was not the only reason why it happened. There were a lot of other reasons that contributed to it as well. But all these different reasons coalesced into the summer of 1919, when it was just, it more or less felt like open war against Black Americans, to the point that you actually saw Black Americans being killed just in streets, and nobody really seemed to do anything about it. And so what you saw was Black veterans who were actually taking up arms against white Americans. And so they were literally buying up guns. They were positioning, people in like sniper spots. They were fortifying neighborhoods. They were barricading cars. Like, they were effectively preparing themselves for war against white Americans. And so, eventually it all, more or less kind of boiled down. Legislation was introduced, different things along those lines. But the Red Summer of 1919 was a real event. It actually happened here in the United States. If you get a chance, like, don't run with it based on what I said. Like check it out, right? Like, actually read about it. It's nuts. It's a crazy moment. But while this whole conversation is going down, right? While this whole conversation is happening, that one of the guys, Jack, begins to succumb to the effects of the super soldier serum, has a heart attack and dies, right? Jack just dies on the spot. And so of these 7 guys, one of them is gone now. And that's actually going to be a repeating pattern over the course of the rest of the story, that guys are just going to die by different means, right? By different situations. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.